objectives, verifying accuracy, and reporting on mechanisms to enhance accuracy and to update the register. And then to do that, we are carrying out a very thorough review of the legal framework, the Constitution and the laws and regulations that govern the voter registration process. We are also carrying out very detailed work on the systems and processes that are in place for voter registration, whether you're talking about the registration center at the local level, whether you're talking about the registration officers at the constituency level, at the regional level, and eventually at the national level where the register is collated. So all those processes and any exceptions or observations that we come up with will be part of our report. But the primary piece of work we are doing is around the register itself. And this is important because there's a question as to what register in terms of the context. That the law has now changed. We no longer have what was previously referred to as the principal register of voters. We have one register of voters. And the entity that has the constitutional responsibility for maintaining that register is the IEBC. So we are working with one register as presented to us by the IEBC. That is the register which includes the register which had been done up to 2013. It includes continuous voter registration, and it includes all the work that has been done around the mass voter registration 1 and 2, and any subsequent continuous voter registration. So once that data is presented, we carry out what we are calling internal analysis to identify any duplicates, to identify any data which we consider orphaned, or in other words, have missing details, whether it's an ID number or passport number or date of birth or whatever other details may be missing from there, and confirm that the details that are required, the relevant details, are on that register. But that is only a review of the register as presented by the IEBC. The more important piece of work required under the law is cross-referencing that register to national population and citizen data. That citizen data is provided by the Register of Persons. It is provided by the Register of Births. It is provided by the National Passports Registry, and it is provided by the Register of Deaths. And you know why all of this is important. So that cross-checking is to confirm if you used an ID to register as a voter, is your ID a valid ID recognized by the Register of Persons? If you used a passport to register as a voter, is your passport a valid passport recognized under the Immigration Department? And when we're looking at the registry of births, we want to confirm, using that data from the Register of Births, from the ID details, from the passport details, comparing the age and the date of birth across there, are there any underage voters who are in the register? These are all the details that we are looking for. And then most importantly is to get the Register of Births, which is maintained by the principal registrar, and is supposed to be maintained on a regular basis. In fact, the Register of Births is supposed to be maintained on a weekly basis. Details collected from hospitals and from chiefs, because you cannot dispose of a body in this country without a burial permit, and that burial permit serves as part of the registration process. So the Register of Deaths is a very important part of this, and that is to help us to identify any deceased persons who may be sitting in the register and recommend to the IBC that they be struck off the register. Then you've got what we are calling analysis of inclusiveness based on population data. That data is the 2009 population updated with projections, again based on births, deaths, and immigration. And the intention here is to analyze the Register of Voters for inclusiveness and to confirm, does the Register of Voters reflect the diversity of Kenya as we know it, by age, by gender, by geography in terms of county, constituency, and ward, as well as various categories of marginalized persons. And all the exceptions will be reported to the IEBC, as I said, in the form of a report. The IEBC then will have the very tough task of implementing those recommendations within some very short timescales, because under the law, the register has to then be presented to the public for verification 90 days before the election. That's around the 10th of May. So this captures the approach and methodology in a nutshell. I will ask my colleague Gerard to go through a little bit more detail in each of the areas that we are looking at, and then we can have a brief session of question and answers. Thank you very much, Gerard.
Good afternoon. My name is Joel Kasimu, as previously introduced, and I will take some...
Head partner Maura just talking to the media in regards to the latest on that particular update. Well, the second speaker, let's listen in on what he's saying regarding the cleaning of the voter register by KPMG.
Right. So as you can see on the screen, there's 5 key areas that we're going to be covering in detail. There is a review, of course, of the legal framework on the basis of which the Register of Voters is prepared and maintained, updated, and all the work that we're going to be doing as part of this audit is anchored on the relevant laws and the Constitution of Kenya. Clearly, the data on the Register of Voters is resident and sits on systems. We're going to be reviewing the controls underlying the systems on which the data is going to be resident, but also the processes that lead to the production of the Register of Voters, and we'll walk through some details shortly. The data will then be subjected to analysis by way of internal analysis of the register that is provided to KPMG as the auditor by the IEBC. But beyond that, we're also going to be matching the details as contained in the register against third-party reference data, and I'll take you through some detail on that. The majority of the work that we're going to be undertaking is undertaken by way of data analytic techniques. Clearly, you can understand, given the short time frame within which this exercise needs to be undertaken, one has got to employ the utilization of tools that will allow efficiency and effective analysis of that information in order to produce any exceptions that need to be dealt with. And then clearly at the end of the day, we need to report any exceptions and provide recommendations to the IEBC in accordance with the law for purposes of updating the register. In that report that we're going to be producing, the IEBC is required to submit that report to the National Assembly within 14 days of it being produced by KPMG and provided to IEBC, and certainly within 30 days of the recommendations and the report being provided to the IEBC, they're required to address any recommendations that have been provided that would lead to the update of the register as appropriate. In terms of our mandate, it's important to clarify that we will verify every single name in the register against third-party data. And the key third-party data that we're going to be looking at here is the Register of Persons, as prepared by the NRB, the National Register of Passports, and the National Register of Births and Deaths. And it's important to emphasize the need for comparison against the National Register of Births and Deaths for purposes of ensuring any perceptions or misperceptions around potential for underage voters being in the register, or the potential for deceased voters being in the register is addressed. In terms of the legal framework, as I said a little earlier, we're going to be considering the Constitution of Kenya, and we've highlighted the relevant articles in the Constitution that inform our methodology. We'll also be looking at the election laws and regulations as amended up to 2017. The Kenya Citizens and Foreign National Management Service Act is quite an important act that is going to be guiding particularly the provision and acquisition of reference data. And within that act, there is a number of acts that are important for us. The Registration of Persons Act, the Births and Deaths Registration Act, and the Kenya Citizenship and Immigration Act. The reason why this is important, it is against this law that we have requested the relevant third-party information for purposes of matching against the register. The audit of the register is not complete unless that matching to original sources of information is undertaken. And the very last one is the Refugee Act, which is also important in ensuring that any registered voters are certainly eligible to vote in accordance with the criteria for eligibility as set out in the law. With respect to systems and processes, we're going to be starting with a review of the recruitment of registration personnel. And most importantly, the registration officers across the 290 constituencies in this country would want to understand the level of expertise and skills that are considered for purposes of one being employed and recruited as a registration officer, because as you can understand, that is the person who is really responsible for ensuring that the voter register within their area is accurate, is complete, and any necessary updates, they're responsible for that process for purposes of then transmitting that to the Center for Centralization of the Register. The voter registration process, and I think important here to say, including the acquisition of biometric information. We're going to be reviewing that to understand the controls and the processes that are undertaken. Voter transfer, and I know that in the course of the last MVR, mass voter registration, there's been quite a lot of transfers of voters from one voting area to another. We want to understand the controls around that and how that process is managed by the IEBC and whether it's reliable and credible. And then, of course, lastly, the voter update process. It is critical that we ensure that we are looking at a current register, a register that has been kept up to date with any information relating to people that are passed on, deceased, or any changes that need to be undertaken on the basis of applicants or voters who wish to have their details updated in whatever shape and form. And we need to understand how that process is actually undertaken, and any adjudications that are necessary are undertaken for purposes of updating the register. Quality assurance and validation processes. As you might know, in the course of the past week or two, the IEBC has been undertaking a process of ongoing quality assurance and validation of the register against the documents and materials that applicants utilized for purposes of providing their information for updating the register. That process is coming to a completion, and we will be reviewing it to understand how reliable that process in ensuring that the final register that then gets gazetted is credible and can be relied upon. Inspection and verification processes. And at this point in time, that is scheduled to start on the May 10th. We want to understand how that process is going to be undertaken, because clearly at the end of the day, Kenyans would want to be assured that when they verify their details using the EV devices, that on the day of voting, when they arrive at the polling station, their details will be in the system. And how is that going to be assured for purposes of ensuring the details are correct? Finally, the biometric registration database. It is important that we ensure that the controls around changes to the database, no one can actually get through a back door and go and make changes to the underlying database. So that those controls are going to be reviewed to ensure that only those changes that are authorized in accordance with policy and laws within the IEBC are done effectively in a manner that is controlled. The security of underlying data and infrastructure. And as I speak about security, we're making reference specifically to that infrastructure that hosts the register of voters. We need to understand how well that infrastructure is controlled. Any maintenance relating to the database or relating to the servers, or relating to the infrastructure in which it's sitting, we need to ensure that that is well controlled. And then lastly, segregation of duties. Who's got access to the system that hosts the register of voters? What can they do in the system? Is that authorized in accordance with the procedures and policies of the Commission? Or is there any possibility of any ICT person who is working within the Commission or anyone else externally being able to get access into that system and make any changes that are untoward, thus compromising the integrity of the data held on that register? Moving on to, I know there's been some questions about which register is going to be the subject of the audit. I like to be very clear that the register that is subject to audit is the register that will be used in the election in August 2017. All the records in that register will be assessed and analyzed against third-party records. And this includes the most recent mass voter registration exercise that has just been undertaken. So for purposes of clarity, we're looking at all data in relation to the register and providing that assurance. Josephat spoke a little earlier about internal analysis of the register. And this essentially is focused on identifying and ensuring the accuracy of voters' details, voters' particulars, what they filled in the form when they went to apply to become a voter. Those details and particulars have been transcribed accordingly into the systems that then results in the register. Completeness of those details, are there any opportunity there could be orphan records? Meaning that, is there a possibility that you could have a voter registered in the register without an associated polling station, for example? Is there any possibility that you could have voters without biometric details attached to their IDs or their passport numbers? So we're going to be reviewing the register to identify whether any such exceptions exist. And of course, and most importantly, the validity of the registration documents that those voters are utilized for purposes of registration. And in accordance with the Constitution, there's really only two documents that one can use. You're either using an ID document or using a passport. And that's the reason why we're comparing the information as contained in the register of voters with respect to IDs and passports with source information with reference to the National Passports Registry and the National Registration Bureau of Persons. Now, we're also going to be looking for completions around the existence of the relevant details that are required to be included in accordance with the law in the register. So if there so happens to be certain fields that are incomplete, we'll be able to identify that and report them for purposes of updates, and the IEBC can then take those recommendations and update the register accordingly. Once we've completed what we're referring to as the internal analysis of the register of voters, we then proceed to comparison of the details as contained in the register of voters against the third-party data. And the third-party data we're making reference to here is the register of persons, the National Passports Registry, the register of deaths, and I think it's important to emphasize this. The register of the deaths, according to the law, the register of deaths should be updated on a regular basis, and one should be available centrally, nationally. We know that there are certain challenges about village registers and data that is maintained by chiefs and so on and so forth. Our expectation is that we will be provided with a central registry of deaths within the country for purposes of this comparison. The register of births as well. Our expectation for purposes of this audit is that the register of births will be availed, and we've written to the relevant agencies within government through the IEBC to obtain this register for purposes of the audit. And then lastly, the National Housing Population Census of 2009 and current projections. And that is going to facilitate the process of assessing the inclusiveness of the registered voters in the register. So if the expectation is that there should be 28 or 29 million Kenyans who are eligible to vote, we're then going to be wanting to understand how many of those have registered. And in the cases where there is variances between the expectation, we're going to be asking some questions about what were the targets that have been set up by the IEBC for purposes of capturing and registering the targeted number of voters. And in the event that there is major variances, we're also going to be wanting to understand what interventions have been put in place by the IEBC to increase the level of participation in the voting process to ensure that those that are eligible have been given an opportunity to register as voters. The objective of this activity in relation to analysis and comparison of the particulars in the register of voters against the third-party reference data is really to identify the following. One, we need to understand whether there are any invalid records. And invalidity is determined on the basis of the law, and the law is very clear on what details need to be in the register and what constitutes eligibility criteria for registration. We would like to identify whether there is any potential for deceased voters, and if there are any that are found to be having deceased based on the registry of deaths, we will provide a list of exceptions to the IEBC so they can then use that for purposes of updating the register accordingly to ensure that there is no perceptions or reality around deceased voters existent on the register. We're also going to be seeking to identify whether there are any registered voters on that register who have not attained the age of 18. And the surest way of doing so is comparing the data that is in the register against the original registration document that they've utilized, whether it's a passport or is an ID. But beyond that, we're also going to be looking at the register of births, which contain the dates of birth to a large extent. The currency of the register, I spoke about that a little earlier. And with currency here, what we mean is where there are necessary updates, whether by way of people that are passed on or voters who may wish to have their details in the register changed, that is done in a timely manner, but more importantly, in a controlled manner in accordance with the policies of the IEBC. Lastly, we're also going to be doing an assessment and analysis of inclusiveness metrics. And the metrics here that we're going to be considering is whether at the end of the day, the register as provided by the Commission is reflective of, one, the demographics of Kenya, but also the eligible voting population. And we're going to be analyzing this by way of age, so we need to understand to what extent have youth participated in the registration process and included in the register. Is that in line with census projections? Is that in line with the NRB data that is available? We're also going to be looking at gender, male and female. To what extent have they been included in the register? And then lastly, of course, geographic distribution. And here we're speaking about county constituencies. What is the extent of inclusiveness across those geographical areas? And is it in line with the projections around the demographics, both by way of the census information and census information of 2009 and current projections, but also NRB data. And we will report that to the IEBC. And as I described a little earlier, where there are variances, we'll then seek to understand what interventions the IEBC undertaken, but we'll also be providing recommendations to help the IEBC going into the future for purposes of ensuring that the level of inclusiveness is increased to an acceptable level and allow every Kenyan an opportunity, once they've attained the age of 18, the opportunity to register as a voter and participate in the electoral process. Reporting. We will produce a list of any exceptions, and that will be shared with the IEBC. Together with those exceptions, we will provide recommendations on what needs to be done to update the register. It is then the responsibility of the IEBC to consider those recommendations and execute and address them for purposes of updating the register. We're also going to be providing specific recommendations around controls around the system, the database, and how that is maintained and monitored to ensure the credibility of the information that is sitting in that database, so that the IEBC can be assured that there is no gaps on the infrastructure they're utilizing that could result in the integrity of data on the system being compromised, thus essentially meaning that the accuracy of the register is then brought into question. As I said, once that report has been issued to the IEBC, within 14 days, it's supposed to be presented by the IEBC to the National Assembly, and within 30 days of the report going to IEBC, they are required, in accordance with the law, to implement any recommendations that have been provided by KPMG. Outcomes. What are the expected outcomes out of this exercise? We would like to inspire confidence in the credibility of the register in accordance with the spirit of the amended election law. 2, the register needs to be credible for purposes of our 2017 elections. And 3, by so doing, that should create an acceptable foundation for free, fair, and I dare say peaceful elections come August 2017. The history that Mr. Mora went through, that we've seen in the past, if we are able to do this successfully and we're able to get a credible and clean register, to a large extent, that will go towards inspiring confidence in our electoral process.